The shriek of steel on the steel was the first sound to truly break the oppressive silence of the high plains. It was a sound of protest, a metallic groan that tore through the vast, empty canvas of pale blue sky and ochre earth. The locomotive, a great black beast panting clouds of steam and soot, slowed its chuffing rhythm, its massive wheels grinding against the rails as the small, sun-bleached settlement of dust rock swam into view through the grime-caked windows. It wasn't so much a town as a scar on the landscape, a collection of tired wooden buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the relentless wind and the crushing emptiness that stretched to every horizon. From the last car, the one typically reserved for cargo, mail, and those who couldn't afford or weren't welcome in the plusher seats up front, a single figure descended. Mara Jane Lawrence did not step down onto the dusty platform. She planted her feet, one after the other, with a deliberation that spoke of a body accustomed to hard ground and heavy loads. In one hand, she carried a battered leather valise that held all her worldly possessions. With the other, she adjusted the simple black shawl that covered her head and broad shoulders, a stark silhouette against the blinding afternoon sun. She was 30 years old, an age when many women in this part of the country were already mothers to a half-dozen children, their bodies softened and rounded by domestic life. Mara was neither soft nor rounded. She was tall for a woman, standing a head above most men she passed, and built not with delicacy but with a sturdiness that came from labor, not leisure. Her hands, resting now on her valise, were long-fingered but wide across the palm, with clean, short nails and the faint tracery of healed cuts and calluses that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully erase. Her face, framed by the dark wool of the shawl, was handsome in a severe sort of way, with a strong jaw, a straight nose, and a mouth that seemed set in a permanent line of neutral observation. But it was her eyes that people remembered. They were the color of a stormy sky, a deep and unsettling gray, and they held a gaze that was unnervingly direct. She did not look at people, she looked into them, and it was a look that offered no apology and asked for no quarter. Back in Kansas, before circumstance and sorrow had set her on this westward path, children had whispered a name for her as she passed the silent giantess. It wasn't meant kindly. It was a name born of fear and misunderstanding, a reaction to her quiet nature, her imposing stature, and the way she walked a steady, ground-covering stride that was entirely without feminine sway or hesitation. She moved like a woman who knew exactly where she was going, even when her heart was a compass spinning wildly in a storm. Today, she knew her destination. A letter, folded and worn soft as cloth in her pocket, had promised her a position. M. J. Lawrence. It was addressed to a skilled leather worker needed for the burgeoning saddlery in Dust Rock. The pay was fair, the work familiar. It was a lifeline. She had spent the last of her savings on the train ticket, a gamble on a stranger's word. The letter had said she would be met at the station. She stood motionless on the platform, a solitary statue of patience, as the few other passengers disembarked and scattered like quail. A family with 3 sunburnt children was greeted by a beaming man in overalls, 2 prospectors, their face bristling with ambition and grime, headed directly for the saloon, their laughter coarse and loud in the quiet air. The train gave a final, mournful hiss of steam, a sigh of release, and began to slowly pull away, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence. No one approached her. No one called her name. Mara's gaze swept across the town. It was a single, wide street of packed dirt, flanked by a dozen or so buildings, a general store, its windows displaying dusty tins and bolts of calico, the saloon, from which the tinny notes of a poorly played piano now drifted, a blacksmith's forge, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil echoing like a steady heartbeat, and further down, a faded sign hanging from a wooden post, Croft's Saddlery and Fine Leather Goods. The promise of being met was a lie, or perhaps a forgotten detail. It mattered little. Disappointment was an old, familiar coat she had learned to wear without complaint. She hefted her valise, the weight settling comfortably into her hand, and began to walk. The boardwalk planks groaned under her boots. Every step seemed to sound an announcement of her arrival. From the shaded porch of the general store, two old men stopped their whittling to stare, their eyes following her progress. A woman, shaking a dusty rug from a second-story window, paused, her arms still, her face a mask of frank curiosity. Mara felt their eyes on her back, a physical pressure. She had felt it her whole life. The stares of men who saw her size as a challenge or an oddity. The stares of women who saw her solitude as a failure or a threat. She met none of their gazes, keeping her own fixed on the sign down the street. To acknowledge them would be to give them power, and power was a currency she could not afford to spend. The air smelled of hot dust, horse manure, and the faint, acrid scent of coal smoke that lingered from the departed train. It was the smell of every hard-scrabbled town she had ever known, a perfume of grim determination and faded dreams. She found Croft's saddlery nestled between the assay office and a small, shuttered building that might have once been a bakery. The shop's large front window was thick with dust, but through the haze, she could see the dark, pleasing shapes of finished saddles mounted on stands, coils of rope, and hanging bridles. The scent of tanned leather and linseed oil seeped through the door, a smell that was, to her, the smell of purpose. It was the first comforting thing she had encountered in Dust Rock. A small bell above the door jingled as she entered, announcing her arrival into the cool, dim interior. The shop was a cathedral of craftsmanship, tools of the trade-alls, knives, stamps, and edgers were arranged with meticulous care on the walls. Bolts of hide were rolled and stacked in a corner, their raw, earthy scent filling the space. Behind a long wooden counter, a man was bent over a ledger, his pen scratching methodically across the page. He was a small, neat man, with thinning hair combed carefully over a shiny scalp and a pair of spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He did not look up immediately, merely finishing his line of figures before making a small, satisfied sound. "Be with you in a moment," he said, his voice thin and dry as old paper. Mara waited in silence. She placed her valise quietly on the floorboards and stood by the counter, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Finally, Silas Croft blotted his ink, closed the ledger, and looked up, a practiced, professional smile already forming on his lips. "Good afternoon. What can I do for you?" The smile faltered and died. His eyes, magnified by the spectacles, widened slightly as he took in her height, the breadth of her shoulders, the directness of her gaze. His practiced merchant's composure dissolved into open-mouthed confusion. He looked from her face, down to her capable hands, and then back up again. "I am M.J. Lawrence," Mara said. Her voice was low and even, without tremor or affectation. "I'm here about the leatherworker position. We corresponded." Comprehension dawned on Mr. Croft's face, followed swiftly by a wave of something else: consternation, discomfort, and a flicker of what looked like fear. He pushed his spectacles further up his nose and cleared his throat, his gaze darting away from hers to a point somewhere over her shoulder. "M.J. Lawrence," he repeated, as if the name itself was the source of the problem. Yes, of course. The letters." He fumbled for a moment, his hands fluttering like nervous birds. I was expecting a man." Mara said nothing. It was not a question, and it required no answer. She simply waited, her stillness a stark contrast to his fidgeting. He licked his lips, his eyes still avoiding hers. "Well, you see, there's been a change in circumstance. The position, it's been filled. The lie was clumsy, poorly constructed, and it hung in the air between them, thin and transparent. Your letter," Mara stated, her tone unchanging, "was postmarked 6 days ago. It said to arrive today. It would be difficult to have filled the position in that time. Mr. Croft, especially in a town this size. Her logic, calm and irrefutable, seemed to corner him. A faint, blotchy red flush crept up his neck. He was no longer just uncomfortable. He was angry. A small man's anger, born of embarrassment and a sudden loss of authority. He finally met her eyes, and his own were hard and resentful. "The work is heavy," he stammered, grasping for a more solid excuse. "Hauling hides, stretching wet leather. It is not work for a woman." "I have been working with leather since I was a girl," she replied, her voice still quiet, yet carrying the weight of undisputed fact. "My father was a saddler. I am stronger than I look." This, it seemed, was the final misstep. The mention of her strength, rather than reassuring him, seemed only to solidify his resolve. The pretense of civility dropped away completely. He straightened his small frame, pulling himself up to his full height, and his voice took on a sharp, dismissive edge. "I will not have it. Madam, I do not hire women to work with hides. It is unseemly. It is not done." He gestured vaguely toward the door. A clear and final dismissal. "I am sorry you have wasted your journey." He was not sorry. His tone made that abundantly clear. He was annoyed, inconvenienced, and eager to have her gone. To have this large, quiet, unsettling woman out of his perfectly ordered world of leather and ledgers. For a long moment, Mara stood perfectly still. The scent of the leather she loved, the sight of the tools she knew how to wield with an artist's precision, filled her senses. This was a place she belonged, a place her skills were needed, and she was being turned away from its door for no reason other than the body she inhabited. She could have argued, she could have raged, she could have brought forth the letters of recommendation she carried, testaments to her skill and tireless work ethic. But she knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones like a winter chill, that it would be useless. His mind was a small, locked box, and she did not possess the key. Slowly, deliberately, she bent down and picked up her valise. Her movements were fluid and controlled, betraying none of the cold fury that was beginning to coil in her stomach. She turned without another word, the worn leather of the handle creaking in her grip. As her hand closed around it, her knuckles went white, the tendons standing out in sharp relief. Her fist tightened, a silent, contained explosion of rage and resignation. She squeezed until her nails bit into her own palm, the small, sharp pain a welcome anchor in a sea of helplessness. She walked out of the shop, the bell above the door sounding a final, mocking jingle behind her. The harsh sunlight was a physical blow after the dim cool of the saddlery. The town's main street seemed wider now, emptier. The stares of the onlookers felt sharper, tinged with a smug, knowing pity. She was adrift, with less than $1 in her pocket and nowhere to go. She started walking again, her stride just as steady, her back just as straight, her expression just as unreadable as it had been upon her arrival. But inside, a familiar litany began to play, a dull, aching refrain that had been the soundtrack to so much of her life. It was not the first time. The air outside the saddlery was a furnace blast, thick and gritty, and it did nothing to cool the hot shame that prickled at Mara's skin. Each step she took along the main street was a deliberate act of will, a refusal to buckle under the weight of 100 invisible eyes. She walked with her head held high, her gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon at the far end of the street, a point of nothingness that felt like her only possible destination. But her posture was a lie. Inside, her spirit was a field of brittle, dry grass, and Silas Croft's rejection had been the careless flick of a match. She could hear the whispers. They were like the rustle of snakes in the scrub brush, just at the edge of hearing, indistinct but undeniably venomous. Words slithered through the air, carried on the hot breeze from the shaded doorways and porches where life in Dustrock idled away. Tall as a telegraph pole, a woman's voice hissed from the general store. "From back east, I'd wager," a man grumbled from the saloon steps. Alone. That word, spoken by many, was the sharpest barb. It was an accusation, a diagnosis, and a sentence all in one. Her own breath was loud in her ears, a steady, controlled rhythm that was the only anchor in the swirling current of judgment. The sun beat down on her black shawl, a garment meant for mourning that now felt like a penance, trapping the heat and pressing it into her skin. The dust, stirred by her boots, rose in fine, choking clouds, coating the hem of her dress and the worn leather of her valise. She was a walking island of dark wool and rejection, moving through a sea of hostile curiosity. Her world had shrunk to the few feet of creaking boardwalk directly in front of her, the weight of the bag in her hand, and the clenching ache in her jaw. She was so focused on the simple mechanics of moving forward that the sound, when it came, struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was a laugh. Not a cruel or mocking laugh, but a short, dry burst of amusement. It was a man's laugh, deep and unforced, and it cut through the murmuring of the town like a sharp, clean axe splitting rotten wood. It was so unexpected, so out of place in the tapestry of suspicion that had enveloped her, that her body reacted before her mind could. Her forward momentum ceased. Her boots froze on the warped planking. Her spine, already ramrod straight, went rigid. Silence fell in the laugh's wake. The whispers died. The town held its breath, waiting to see what would follow. Slowly, as if moving against a great and powerful current, Mara turned. He was leaning against a hitching post in front of the livery stable. One booted foot crossed over the other. The posture was casual, almost lazy. But there was nothing lazy about the man himself. He was as tall as she was, perhaps an inch taller, with shoulders that strained the seams of his dusty cotton shirt. His sleeves were rolled up past the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with a roadmap of old scars, some white and thin as thread, others puckered and angry-looking. They were the scars of a man who worked with unpredictable, powerful animals. A thick, well-kept beard the color of dark walnut covered the lower half of his face, and his hair, a shade lighter, was ruffled by the breeze. His eyes, fixed on her from under the brim of a sweat-stained felt hat, were the clear, startling blue of a winter sky. They held the same frank amusement as his laugh, but something else, too, an appraisal, a recognition, a deep baritone voice, with a low rumble like stones shifting at the bottom of a riverbed, followed the laugh. A saddle-maker with no one to hire her, he said, not to the town, but directly to her. His voice carried easily in the still air. And here I am, with 3 broken cinches and a saddle tree that needs reinforcing before the week is out. Mara stared at him, her face an impassive mask. Her mind, moments before a numb void, was now racing. This was not the pity of a do-gooder or the leering interest of a saloon patron. This was something else entirely. She took in every detail of him, the worn heels of his boots, the calluses on his knuckles, the way the sun had etched fine lines around his eyes. He was a man of the land, as weathered and durable as the parched earth beneath their feet. He hadn't been whispering with the others. He had been watching and waiting. He pushed himself off the hitching post with a smooth, economical movement and took a step toward her. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away, a distance that was neither threateningly close nor dismissively far. He made no move to take her bag, no false gesture of chivalry. He simply stood there, meeting her unwavering gaze with one of his own. "Callan Wade," he introduced himself, his voice dropping slightly, as if sharing a confidence. "I run the horse ranch west of town, the Bar W." She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the name but offering nothing in return. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as the afternoon heat. The town remained a gallery of silent spectators. They were watching a play unfold, a confrontation between 2 strange and formidable figures, the quiet woman and the man who dared to speak to her. Mara's mind was a whirlwind of suspicion. Was this a joke at her expense? a new, more elaborate form of humiliation. Men in towns like this did not offer work to solitary women out of the goodness of their hearts. There was always a price, a hidden ledger of expectations and obligations that she had long ago sworn she would never pay. She had seen the way the prospectors had looked at her, a crude and hungry assessment. But Callan Wade's eyes were different. They were clear, direct, and held no hint of that particular brand of ugliness. They simply looked at her, at Mara Jane Lawrence, and saw a person. "Mr. Croft doesn't hire women," she stated flatly. The words were a test, a piece of sharp granite thrown into the water to see how deep it was. She was not asking for sympathy. She was warning him, drawing the battle lines. "This is who they think I am. Are you one of them?" A corner of Callan Wade's mouth lifted in a ghost of a smile. It didn't reach his eyes, which remained steady and serious. "I know Silas Croft," he said, his tone dry. "He's a man who's more comfortable with numbers in a book than with the real world. He wouldn't know a good stitch from a snake bite." He paused, letting his words settle in the air. Then he delivered the final, crucial blow to her defenses. "Besides," he added, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to her strong, capable hands before meeting her eyes again, "I'm not afraid of a woman who knows how to use a saddler's knife." The words struck home with the force of a revelation. He understood. In that single sentence, he had acknowledged her skill, dismissed Croft's prejudice, and declared his own position, all without a wasted syllable. He had seen past her height, past her gender, past the whispers and the stares, and had seen the one thing she defined herself by, her craft. He saw the leather worker, not the anomaly. The tight knot of fury and despair in Mara's chest, a knot that had been pulling tighter with every step she took from Croft's shop, began to loosen. For the first time since the train had arrived, she felt the oppressive weight on her shoulders lift, just a fraction. It was as if a window had been opened in a sealed, suffocating room, letting in a sliver of fresh, breathable air. She continued to study him, her gray eyes searching his blue ones for any hint of deceit, any flicker of falsehood. She found none. What she found instead was a quiet confidence, a self-assurance that had no need for the approval of the gossips on the porches. He was his own man, beholden to his own judgment. In that, they were alike. The world began to come back into focus. She could feel the sun on her face again, hear the distant, rhythmic clang from the blacksmith's forge. She was still in Dust Rock, still a stranger, still the subject of speculation. But something had fundamentally shifted. A hand had been offered, not a hand of charity, but a hand of practical, mutual need. It was a language she understood. It was a foundation on which something solid could be built. She thought of her dwindling funds, of the cold prospect of a night spent in the open with no shelter and no hope. She thought of the humiliation of having to board the next train, defeated, heading to yet another town where she would be met with the same locked doors and the same suspicious eyes. Then she looked at Callan Wade, at the honest set of his jaw and the straightforward clarity of his gaze. It was a risk. The world was full of risks, but it felt different from the blind gamble that had brought her here. This felt like a calculated one. After a silence that felt a lifetime long, Mara Lawrence gave a single, small nod. The movement was barely perceptible, but in the charged atmosphere of the street, it was as definitive as a signed contract. "All right," she said. The word was quiet, almost carried away by the wind, but it was firm. It was the sound of a gate, long rusted shut, creaking open an inch. It was the sound of acceptance. The Bar W Ranch was not a place of gentle beauty. It was a testament to raw, stubborn persistence, carved out of a landscape that was actively hostile to human ambition. The ranch house, a long, low structure of rough-hewn timber, stood with its back to the prevailing north wind, a sprawling barn. Its wood, weathered to the color of old silver, dominated the compound, its great maw perpetually open to the corrals and the vast, rolling plains beyond, fences, Thousands of posts strung with taut wire marched across the hillsides in every direction, the only things breaking the relentless monotony of grass and sky. This was Callan Wade's kingdom, a world built not of words and laws, but of sweat, muscle, and an unyielding will. For Mara Lawrence, it became a sanctuary. Life settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the horses. Her days began before the first hint of dawn, in the deep, velvet blackness of the high plains. She would wake in her small, Spartan room off the main kitchen, a space offered with no ceremony and accepted with a quiet nod to the distant, lonesome cry of a coyote. And every morning, without fail, a tin mug of coffee would be waiting for her on the edge of the great cast-iron stove. It was black, scalding hot, and strong enough to wake the dead. She never saw Callan leave it, but she knew it was his doing. The gesture was their only morning conversation, a silent acknowledgement that the day's work had begun. In the pre-dawn chill, with the stars still scattered like chips of ice across the sky, she would make her way to the barn. The air inside was warm and alive, thick with the sweet, earthy smell of hay, the sharp tang of horsehide, and the underlying ammonia scent of the stalls. The animals would stir as she entered, their soft whickers and snort a gentle greeting. Mara moved among them with a quiet confidence that the horses, sensitive creatures that they were, seemed to recognize and trust. Her hands, so often seen as too large or too rough for a woman, were instruments of soothing precision as she curried their coats, checked their legs for swelling, and picked their hooves clean of stones and dirt. As the sun rose, painting the eastern sky in brutal strokes of orange and pink, the real work would begin. Callan, having already ridden the fence lines or checked on the new foals in the far pasture, would work alongside her, though rarely with her. They operated in a shared space, a universe of common purpose that required few words. He might be in the corral, breaking a spirited young colt, his low, patient voice a constant, calming murmur. Mara, meanwhile, would set up her workshop in a corner of the barn that she had claimed as her own. Here, surrounded by the tools of her trade, she was no longer the silent giantess or the solitary woman. She was a master craftswoman. The broken cinches Callan had mentioned were just the beginning. There was a constant flow of work stirrup leathers that had stretched and thinned, fleece linings worn bald from sweat and friction, saddle horns that had come loose from the strain of roping a steer. She would sit for hours on a low stool, a heavy leather apron protecting her dress, the familiar weight of an awl in her hand. Her stitches were small, tight, and perfectly even, a line of disciplined artistry that would hold against the most punishing work. She burnished the edges of new leather until they shone, her movements economical and precise. This was more than a job. It was a meditation, in the focused, repetitive motions, in the transformation of broken things into whole, functional objects. She found a quiet, unshakable sense of peace. Some afternoons were spent at the forge. The previous hand had also served as a passable farrier, and the tools remained. Mara, having learned the skill from her father, fired up the bellows without a word of instruction. The work was brutally hot and physically demanding. She would pump the bellows until the coals glowed with a demonic heat, thrust a length of iron into their heart, and then, with sweat beading on her brow and dripping from her chin, she would hammer the glowing metal into the crescent shape of a horseshoe. There was a raw power in it that she relished, the clang of steel on steel, the hiss of hot iron plunged into a bucket of water, the strength required to hold a horse's hoof steady between her knees. More than one of the ranch hands, lean, wiry men who initially regarded her with open skepticism, would stop and watch, their expressions shifting from doubt to a grudging, silent respect as she expertly shod a difficult mare. Her evenings were islands of solitude, after a long day. When her muscles ached with a deep and satisfying fatigue, she would retreat to the ranch house kitchen. The hands ate in their own bunkhouse, and Callan often took his plate out onto the porch, his back to the house as he watched the last of the light fade from the sky. Mara ate alone at the long, scrubbed pine table. The food was simple, usually a hearty beef stew or beans with salt pork, accompanied by thick slices of sourdough bread. The only sound was the clink of her spoon against the tin plate and the eternal, ceaseless voice of the wind. It was a lonely sound. That wind, it howled around the corners of the house, rattled the window panes in their frames, and moaned down the chimney. It spoke of vast, empty spaces, of isolation, of the immense and indifferent power of the wilderness. In Kansas, she had hated the wind. It had always sounded like it was trying to tear everything down. But here, at the Bar W, it began to sound different. It was a constant presence, a companion to her solitude. It was the sound of the world breathing, and she was a part of it. Callan remained an enigma. He was a man of profound stillness and few words. Their conversations were brief and strictly practical. The roan in the north pasture has a slight limp. We're low on Neat's foot oil. There's a storm coming in from the west. Yet, in the vast silences between these statements, a different kind of communication was taking place. He would leave a freshly sharpened knife on her workbench without comment. If he saw her struggling to lift a heavy roll of hide, he would appear at her side, take one end without a word, and help her carry it. And always, there was the coffee. He never complimented her work directly, but she would see him running a hand over a newly repaired saddle, testing the strength of her stitches with his thumb, his expression thoughtful and satisfied. That silent approval was worth more to her than a dozen flowery speeches from a man like Silas Croft. Callan Wade judged people by what they did, not by what they were, and in his world of actions, Mara had found an equal footing. One night, a week or perhaps two into her tenure at the ranch, the rhythm was slightly different. A valuable stud horse had thrown a shoe, and the animal was too temperamental for any of the regular hands to handle. Mara had spent the late afternoon and early evening working, first to calm the beast, and then to forge and fit a new shoe by the light of several lanterns hung from the barn rafters. The work was done. The horse was calm and secure in its stall. The other hands had long since retired to the bunkhouse, but Mara, still humming with the energy of the work, did not want to return to the quiet of the kitchen. Instead, she sat on her workbench, meticulously cleaning her tools, the soft rasp of an oilcloth on steel the only sound in the cavernous barn. The air was cool and smelled of lantern oil and hay. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. She looked up to see Callan standing in the wide doorway, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted night sky. He wasn't looking at her, but up at the rafters, as if inspecting the structural integrity of the old building. He stood there for a long time, simply sharing the silence with her. Finally, he walked over to the stall that housed the newly shod stud, running a gentle hand down the horse's flank. The animal, which had been skittish and wild just hours before, merely nickered softly and leaned into his touch. "He's a difficult one," Callan said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "My father bred him, more spirit than sense." "He has a good heart," Mara replied, her voice surprisingly soft. "He's just afraid. Someone was rough with him once." Callan nodded, accepting her assessment without question. He turned from the horse and looked at her, really looked at her. In the flickering golden light of the lanterns, his blue eyes were thoughtful. An impulse, born of the strange intimacy of the late hour and the comfortable silence they had shared, rose up in Mara. It was a question that had followed her for years, a question she had always been too proud or too afraid to ask. But here, with this quiet, steady man, it felt safe. "Do I scare you, Mr. Wade?" she asked, her voice even. He didn't seem surprised by the question. He leaned against the stall door, crossing his arms over his broad chest. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth, visible even in his thick beard. He considered her for a moment, his eyes glinting with a familiar, gentle amusement. The silence stretched, But it wasn't awkward. It was the silence of a man giving an honest question the consideration it deserved. "No, Miss Lawrence," he said finally, his voice laced with a teasing warmth she had never heard before. He shook his head slowly. "Not enough." The words hung in the air. Not enough. It was an answer so unexpected, so perfectly contrary to a lifetime of experience, that it broke through every wall she had ever built. It wasn't a denial. It was a challenge. It was a compliment of the highest order, an acknowledgement of her strength that framed it not as a flaw to be feared, but as a quality to be met. A sound bubbled up from deep inside her, a sound she had not made in years. It started as a small tremor in her chest and escaped her lips as a short, sharp burst of air, a laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was genuine. It was light and free and utterly without bitterness. It was the sound of a window being thrown open not just an inch, but all the way, letting the cool night air rush in. It was the first time she had laughed since she'd left Kansas, and in the warm, lantern-lit barn, surrounded by the scent of leather and hay. Callan Wade smiled back at her. A real smile this time, one that reached his clear blue eyes, and for the first time in a very long time. Mara Jane Lawrence did not feel alone. That single shared laugh in the barn did not open the floodgates of conversation between them, but it did change the quality of the silence. It was no longer just an absence of words, but a space of shared understanding, a comfortable quiet that had been seasoned with a moment of genuine connection. The daily rhythm of the Bar W continued unabated: the pre-dawn coffee, the long hours of labor, the solitary evening meals, but a new subtle thread of intimacy was being woven into the fabric of their days. It was on a Sunday, 2 weeks after that night, that the routine was broken. Sunday was the only day the relentless pace of ranch work eased. It was a day for mending clothes, writing letters, or simply sitting on the porch and watching the heat shimmer above the plains. It was also market day in Dust Rock. "I'm heading into town for supplies," Callan announced at the end of the day Saturday, his voice carrying to where Mara was mending a bridle under the barn overhang. "We need salt, flour, and the blacksmith has a new set of bits for me. The wagon leaves after sunrise." It was not an invitation, merely a statement of fact. But Mara looked up from her work, her hands still. She had not left the Bar W since the day she arrived. The ranch had become her entire world, a self-contained universe where her skills were valued and her presence was accepted without question. The thought of returning to Dust Rock, to the whispers and the stares, sent a cold ripple of apprehension through her. Yet, her own small supply of soap was gone, and she needed thread and a new needle. "I have some things I need to procure," she said, her language as formal and practical as his. "Be ready at sunrise," he replied, and that was that. The next morning, she climbed onto the wagon seat beside him as the sky was just beginning to blush with color. She wore her one good dress, a dark blue calico, clean and pressed, and had tied her hair back neatly at the nape of her neck. The black shawl was left behind in her room. As they rode, the rising sun cast their long shadows before them on the dusty track. They passed the miles in their usual quiet. The only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the soft snort of the 2 sturdy draft horses. Mara watched the landscape unfold, the familiar rolling hills of the ranch giving way to the flat, open plain that surrounded the town. It looked different from this vantage point, less threatening than it had seemed when she was a desperate woman walking towards an uncertain future. Dust Rock on a Sunday was a different creature entirely from the sleepy, judgmental town she remembered. The main street was crowded with wagons, horses tied to every available hitching post. Families in their Sunday best strolled along the boardwalks. The air was filled with a cacophony of sounds, the laughter of children, the good-natured haggling of farmers and their customers, the distant strains of a hymn being practiced in the small white church at the end of the street. The weekly market was in full swing, a vibrant, chaotic hub of commerce and community. Callan guided the wagon to a spot near the livery and tethered the horses. "I'll take care of the grain and the blacksmith," he said. "Meet back here when you're done." He looked at her then, his gaze steady. "The general store is run by a man named Gable. He's an honest fellow." It was as close as he could come to saying, "You'll be treated fairly there." Mara nodded and, with her small reticule in hand, stepped down into the throng. For a moment, she felt a return of the old anxiety. People still looked at her. Her height alone made her stand out. But the stares were different now. The initial hostility had been replaced by a kind of fascinated curiosity. She was no longer just the strange, solitary woman. She was Callan Wade's leather worker, a known, if unusual, quantity. She heard her name whispered as she passed. Lawrence, a sound that was now a fact rather than an accusation. She kept her composure, her expression neutral, and made her way through the crowd to Gable's general store. An hour later, her purchases made, she found Callan already at the wagon, loading heavy sacks of flour and oats. She placed her own small parcels on the seat and, without a word, moved to help him. He didn't protest, and they worked together in a seamless, efficient rhythm, lifting and stacking the heavy supplies. When they were finished, he gestured with his chin toward a small stall where a woman was selling fresh eggs and jars of preserves. "Mrs. Gable makes the best apple butter in the territory," he said, "and we're out of eggs." They walked over together. The stall was run by a tiny, bird-like woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her name was Agnes, and she was, as Mara would soon learn, the unofficial historian and gossip-in-chief of Dustrock, as Callan began to negotiate for a dozen eggs and a large jar of apple butter. Agnes's gaze flickered to Mara, who stood slightly behind him. The old woman leaned over to a neighbor who was inspecting her jams, her voice a conspiratorial, carrying the whisper that was clearly meant to be overheard. "That's her," she murmured, her head barely moving. "The Lawrence woman, the one working for Wade." The neighbor nodded, her eyes wide. Agnes leaned closer. "They say, back in Salina, she took down 2 armed road agents who tried to rob her husband's store, broke one fella's arm with a stool. They say the other one just ran." Mara froze. The story, polished and exaggerated by time and distance, was laid bare in the middle of the Dustrock market. She felt a hot flush creep up her neck. She braced herself for Callan's reaction, a sideways glance, a stiffening of his shoulders, a sudden awkwardness between them. But Callan did none of those things. He seemed not to have heard. He calmly counted out the coins for the eggs and apple butter, took the parcels from Agnes with a polite nod, and turned back toward the wagon. His expression was unchanged. He hadn't flinched, hadn't acknowledged the whisper in any way. He had simply ignored it, rendering it powerless. As they walked away, Mara glanced back and saw Agnes watching them, a look of thwarted curiosity on her face. Callan's non-reaction was a shield, a silent defense more powerful than any words could have been. He was not interested in rumor. He had made his own assessment of her, and the gossip of an old woman in the marketplace was irrelevant. The gratitude that washed over Mara was so profound it almost buckled her knees. The ride back to the ranch was even quieter than the journey in. The sun was beginning its slow descent, bathing the landscape in a soft, golden light. The harsh edges of the plains were softened, the colors deepened. The rumor, however, lay unspoken between them on the wagon seat, a tangible presence. Mara found herself studying Callan's profile as he drove, the strong line of his jaw, the steady concentration in his eyes as he watched the trail. She wondered what he was thinking, if he was reevaluating the woman who sat beside him. That evening, after the horses were fed and the chores were done, a strange restlessness settled over Mara. She found herself on the porch of the main house, watching the last vestiges of daylight bleed from the sky. The air grew cool, and the first stars began to appear, sharp and brilliant in the clear, dark expanse. She heard the soft thud of boots on the porch steps and turned to see Callan emerge from the house, a mug of coffee in each hand. He offered one to her without a word. She took it, the warmth of the tin seeping into her cold fingers. He didn't sit in his usual chair, but leaned against a porch post near her, sipping his own coffee and gazing out at the deepening twilight. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "Selina," he said finally, his voice quiet, not turning to look at her. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple, gentle opening. Mara's hand tightened around her mug. She had two choices. She could deny the story, dismiss it as town gossip, and the fragile trust between them would be broken. Or she could tell him the truth. Looking at his strong, quiet form outlined against the starlight, she knew there was only one real choice. "It wasn't quite like that," she began, her own voice low. "My husband, Samuel, he owned a dry goods store. We were closing up one night. 2 men came in. They had guns." She paused, the memory still sharp and cold after all these years. "Samuel," he froze. He was not a man built for violence. He just stood there, his hands raised, his face white as a sheet. They wanted the cash box, but one of them. He looked at me. I was standing behind the counter. Her voice faltered for a second. He had a look in his eye that was about more than just money. Callan remained silent, a still and patient listener in the darkness. "Something inside me just snapped," Mara continued, finding the words now. "I wasn't thinking. I just acted. There was a heavy oak stool behind the counter. I picked it up and I hit the man closest to me. I hit him hard. In the arm, the one holding the gun. I heard the bone crack. He screamed and dropped the pistol. The other one, the one by the door. He just stared for a second, his eyes wide, and then he turned and ran. I stood there with this stool in my hands, shaking, and Samuel was still standing in the same spot, staring at me." She took a shaky breath. "He never looked at me the same way after that. The town, they called me a hero. They wrote about it in the paper, but Samuel, he started to look at me with fear. He said I hadn't even screamed, that I hadn't cried. He said it wasn't natural for a woman to be so calm in the face of such things. He started sleeping in the store, said he was protecting the inventory, but we both knew he was just afraid to be in the same house as me." She fell silent. The story told. The shame was not in the telling, but in the memory of her husband's fear, a fear that had turned her into a monster in his eyes. One day, about a month later, I came home and his bags were packed. He told me he was leaving. He said he couldn't live with a woman whose strength made him feel like less of a man. I just stood there and watched him go. And he was right. I didn't cry. All the tears I had were frozen inside me. She finished her story and stared out into the vast, dark plains, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had laid the ugliest, most painful part of her past at his feet, and she braced for his judgment, for the inevitable retreat. Callan pushed himself off the porch post. He walked over and took the empty mug from her unresisting hand. He stood before her for a moment, and in the faint starlight, she could just make out the expression on his face. It was not pity. It was a deep, quiet anger, but it was not directed at her. "Weak men," he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl of conviction. "Always find a way to blame strong women for their own shortcomings." He turned and went back inside, leaving her alone on the porch with his words echoing in the vast, silent night. And for the first time, the memory of Samuel's departure brought not a sting of shame, but a flicker of pride. Callan's words had not just excused her past, they had validated it. They had validated her. The cold stone in her chest began to feel a little bit lighter. Callan's words on the porch that night had settled something deep within Mara. They had not erased the past, but they had reframed it, transforming a source of shame into a testament of survival. In the weeks that followed, as summer bled into the harsher beauty of autumn, the quiet companionship between them deepened. The vast, unspoken spaces that defined their relationship were no longer filled with caution and appraisal, but with a comfortable, burgeoning trust. The morning coffee ritual, the silent assistance with a heavy task, the shared glances across the corral, each was a small, sturdy stitch in a bond that was becoming as strong and reliable as the tack she mended. The days grew shorter. The wind sharpened its teeth, and the vast prairie grasses cured to the color of old gold. The work on the ranch shifted, becoming a race against the coming winter. Hay was stacked to the rafters in the barn. Fences were mended with a new urgency, and the horses began to grow their thick winter coats. Mara worked alongside Callan and the hands from sunup to sundown, her body tired and aching by nightfall, but her spirit strangely content. The Bar W was no longer just a place of employment. It was the first place she had ever truly felt at home. The storm arrived with the sudden, violent temperament of the high plains. One late afternoon, the sky, which had been a placid, cloudless blue, turned a bruised and malevolent shade of purple-gray on the western horizon. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange, electric tension. The horses in the corral grew skittish, their ears twitching, their nostrils flaring at the scent of ozone on the wind. "Get the herd into the north pasture, close to the ravine." Callan ordered the hands, his voice sharp and clear above the rising wind. "Mara, help me secure the barn." There was no time to spare. As the hands galloped off, their shouts swallowed by the wind. Mara and Callan worked in a practiced, silent tandem. They herded the remaining horses into their stalls, their movements swift and sure. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful prelude to the coming deluge, whipping hay from the loft and rattling the great barn doors in their frames. Together, they strained against the force of the wind, sliding the massive crossbeam into place just as the first fat, cold drops of rain began to fall. The sound on the barn's tin roof was deafening, a sudden, furious drumming that escalated within moments into a torrential roar. The world outside the barn dissolved into a churning, gray chaos. They were trapped, isolated in a pocket of warm, hay-scented air, the storm raging around them like a pack of hungry wolves. Lanterns, lit against the unnatural twilight, cast long, dancing shadows, making the cavernous space feel both immense and strangely intimate. With the immediate crisis averted, a quiet lull fell between them. Callan went to soothe a young mare that was kicking nervously against its stall door, his voice a low, calming murmur that was almost lost in the din of the rain. Mara, not one to be idle, returned to her workbench. She had been putting the finishing touches on a new saddle, a personal project for Callan to replace his own, which was nearly beyond repair. She was tooling a complex pattern of oak leaves and acorns into the fender, a design of her own creation. She picked up a fine swivel knife, its blade honed to a razor's edge. She leaned over the leather, her brow furrowed in concentration, the rhythmic tap of her mallet a small, steady counterpoint to the storm's fury. The lantern light gleamed on the moist leather and the polished steel of her tool. A particularly violent clap of thunder shook the very foundations of the barn, and at that exact moment, her knife, slick with saddle soap, slipped. It was not a dramatic injury, just a careless, glancing blow. But the blade was mercilessly sharp. A thin, bright line of red appeared across the fleshy part of her palm, just below her thumb. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath, and instinctively dropped the knife. Blood, dark in the lantern light, began to well up, a single, perfect crimson droplet falling onto the pristine, tooled leather. "Damn it," she whispered, more in frustration at marring the saddle than in pain. Before she could even reach for a rag, Callan was there. He had moved with a silent swiftness that startled her. One moment he was across the barn. The next, he was at her side, his presence solid and immediate. His gaze dropped from her face to her hand, and his expression, usually so impassive, tightened with concern. "Let me see," he said, his voice a low command that brooked no argument. Gently, but with an undeniable firmness. He took her wrist. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly careful. He turned her palm up to the light, his thumb brushing away the blood to inspect the wound. It was a clean but deep slice, already bleeding freely. "It needs to be cleaned," he said, his eyes still fixed on her hand. "Stay put." He disappeared for a moment into the small tack room and returned with a clean strip of linen from a medical kit and a small basin of water. He set them on the workbench beside her. Mara watched, a strange sense of detachment settling over her as he knelt before her. He didn't ask her to lift her hand. He simply took it again, cradling it in his own as if it were something precious and fragile. The world shrank to the small circle of lantern light around them. The roar of the storm outside became a distant, muffled backdrop. All of her senses were focused on the man kneeling at her feet. She could smell the scent of rain and wet earth on his clothes, see the way the golden light caught in the strands of his dark beard. His focus was absolute. He dipped a corner of the linen into the water and began to clean the cut with painstaking gentleness. His touch was firm, efficient, yet incredibly tender. Every brush of the cloth against her skin sent a jolt, not of pain, but of a strange, unfamiliar electricity through her veins. He did not speak, and neither did she. The silence was charged, humming with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm. His eyes, a deep and serious blue, never left her hand, yet she felt their gaze on every inch of her body. When the wound was clean, he took the rest of the dry linen and began to wrap it snugly around her palm, his movements deft and practiced. His fingers brushed against hers, lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. In that moment, the air grew thick, heavy, and difficult to breathe. He finished tying the knot, but he did not release her hand. He kept it resting in his thumb now making slow, absent-minded circles on the inside of her wrist, directly over her racing pulse. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. The amusement was gone. The quiet reserve was gone. What she saw in their blue depths was a raw and unguarded honesty, a profound intensity that held her captive. It was a look of deep concern, of possession, of a longing so potent it was almost a physical force. In his eyes, she saw her own unspoken feelings reflected back at her, magnified and undeniable. The carefully constructed walls of her self-possession, the armor she had worn for a decade, seemed to melt away under that searing gaze. The space between their faces was a chasm of possibility. She could feel his breath, warm and steady. On her cheek, the barn, the storm. The entire world had ceased to exist. There was only the low light, the scent of leather and rain, and the electrifying contact of his hand on hers. A question, bold and terrifying and absolutely necessary, rose from the deepest part of her. It was a whisper, a breath of sound almost lost in the drumming of the rain. "What if I were to kiss you?" His gaze did not waver, his thumb stilled on her wrist. The silence that followed her question was the most profound she had ever known. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. He simply held her eyes, letting the weight of her question settle between them. When he finally spoke, his own voice was a low, rough whisper that seemed to vibrate through the very hand that held hers. "I'd let you." The answer was a surrender and a promise. It was not the response of a conqueror, but of an equal. He was not taking. He was offering. He was giving her the choice, the power, the final say. The trust in that simple statement was more intimate, more breathtaking than any kiss could ever be. The chasm between them beckoned. All she had to do was lean forward. All she had to do was close the distance. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, wild bird. She saw his eyes flicker down to her mouth and then back to her own. He was waiting. But a deep, instinctual wisdom, A sense of rightness that came from the same core of her being as the question had, held her back. This moment, this perfect, terrifying, beautiful moment, was too precious to be rushed. What was growing between them was like a rare, slow-blooming desert flower. It needed time. It needed patience. To seize it now would be to tear it from its roots. A slow, sad, beautiful smile touched Mara's lips. It was a smile of pure understanding, of shared knowledge, with a reluctance that was a physical ache. She gently pulled her hand from his grasp. She stood up from the workbench and turned away, not to flee, but to simply put a few feet of necessary space between them, to let the charged air cool. She walked to the great barn door and pressed her uninjured palm against the rough, cool wood, listening to the sound of the rain, which was already beginning to soften, its fury spent. The immediate tension had passed, but something new and unbreakable had taken its place. It was a promise, a certainty that hummed in the air between them. She didn't have to look back to know he was watching her. They both knew it was coming, just not tonight. The moment in the barn, though unspoken of, had altered the landscape between them. The air was charged with a new and delicate awareness, a quiet hum of possibility that vibrated just beneath the surface of their daily routines. But while the Bar W Ranch had become a world unto itself, it was not immune to the gravitational pull of dust rock, and in a town as small and dry as dust rock, gossip was the only thing that grew faster than the weeds. The change was subtle at first. On their next trip for supplies, the stares that followed Mara were no longer just curious, they were laced with a new, knowing quality. The whispers were sharper, more defined. Women clustered together outside the general store, their voices dropping as she approached, their eyes dissecting her from head to toe before they turned away with tight, disapproving frowns. Men at the saloon watched her pass, their crude jokes and loud laughter following her down the street. The whispers took on a life of their own, twisting the quiet dignity of her arrangement with Callan into something sordid and cheap. He lives under her spell, one rumor claimed. That Kansas giantess has bewitched him. Another, more venomous, circulated among the town's more pious women. A shameless widow, living out there alone with him. It's an affront to decency. They saw her strength not as an asset, but as a weapon of seduction. They saw Callan's decency not as respect, but as weakness. The quiet world they had built was being dismantled from the outside in, board by rotten board. Mara felt it as a constant, low-grade fever of humiliation. She retreated further into herself, her face becoming a stony, impenetrable mask whenever she had to go to town. Callan, for his part, seemed oblivious. Or perhaps he simply chose to ignore it. He treated the townsfolk with the same curt, business-like demeanor he always had, his presence a silent rebuke to their petty conjectures. But Mara saw the way their insinuations bounced off him and landed squarely on her. She was the outsider, the anomaly, the cause of the friction. She was the storm that had descended upon his quiet life. The situation came to a head on a crisp, still afternoon in late autumn. The air was unnaturally quiet, the sky a vast and empty blue. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Mara was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the evening's bread, when she heard the sound of a wagon and several horses arriving in the ranch yard. It was too early for the hands to be back from the high pastures. She moved to the window and saw 3 men dismounting in front of the main house. Her heart sank. She recognized them immediately. There was Silas Croft, the saddler, his face pinched with self-importance. Beside him stood Mr. Gable from the general store, a man Callan had called honest, but whose face was now a mask of worried disapproval. The third man was the town's preacher, Reverend Miller, a tall, gaunt figure whose piety was matched only by his love for interfering in the lives of his flock. It was a delegation of civic virtue, and she knew, with a certainty that turned the bread dough to lead in her hands, that they had come about her. Callan emerged onto the porch to meet them, wiping his hands on a rag. He did not invite them to sit. He simply stood at the top of the steps, a solid, unmoving figure, and waited. Mara backed away from the window, her pulse a frantic drum against her ribs. She retreated into the shadows of the main room, which connected the kitchen to the front door. The door was slightly ajar to let in the afternoon air. From her position, hidden in the gloom, she could see and hear everything. "Gentlemen," Callan said, his voice flat and devoid of welcome. "This is a surprise." "Callan," the preacher began, his tone unctuous and paternal. "We've come as friends, as neighbors concerned for your welfare and the good name of this community. My welfare is my own concern, Reverend," Callan replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "And the community's good name seems to do just fine without my help." Silas Croft, emboldened by the preacher's presence, stepped forward. "It's about the woman, Wade," he said, unable to keep a sneer from his voice. "This arrangement, it isn't right. People are talking. It reflects poorly on you. Your family has been respected in this valley for 2 generations. "The woman," Callan said, his voice dropping an octave, "has a name. It's Miss Lawrence, and she is my employee. I pay her a fair wage for a skill no one else in this town possesses. As you well know, Croft." Mara flinched in the shadows, the targeted remark hitting its mark. "But a woman of her reputation." "Mister," Gable chimed in, wringing his hands, "we've all heard the stories from Selena, a violent, mannish creature, and living out here unchaperoned, it sets a bad example. It's a blight." From behind the door, Mara felt her breath catch in her throat. A blight. The word was a physical blow. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a cry, her knuckles white against her lips. "She is a burden to you, Callan," the preacher insisted, his voice rising with righteous fervor. "A liability to your good standing. Can't you see that we are only asking you to consider the consequences? To do the decent thing, send her on her way. For your own sake. For the sake of Dust Rock." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Mara watched as Callan's hands, which had been hanging loosely at his sides, slowly curled into fists. His entire body went rigid, a statue of cold, contained fury. When he finally spoke, his voice was as sharp and deadly as a shard of obsidian. "The 3 of you will get off my land. Now." "Now, Callan, be reasonable," Gable started. "I am not a man to be trifled with on his own property." Callan cut him off. Taking a single, deliberate step down from the porch, the movement was pure, controlled menace. "The business of the Bar W is my business. Who I hire is my decision. And the opinions of hypocrites and gossips mean less to me than the dust on my boots. I will not have my employee, a good and honorable woman, insulted on her own doorstep. Now get out and do not come back." There was no arguing with the tone in his voice. The 3 men, their faces a mixture of shock and indignation, shuffled backward. They mounted their horses and wagon in a flustered, undignified haste and retreated down the track, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent fury in their wake. Callan stood watching them go, his back ramrod straight, until they were a small speck on the horizon. Then he turned and went back into the house. Mara fled. She slipped back into the kitchen, her heart hammering so violently she thought it would break through her ribs. She leaned against the far wall, her body trembling, the voices of the men echoing in her head. A burden, a liability, a blight. He had defended her. He had stood for her with a ferocity and loyalty that stole her breath away. And in doing so, he had proven their point. She was a source of trouble. She had brought the ugliness of the town to his doorstep. Her presence was costing him the respect of his neighbors, tarnishing his family's name. The bitter, familiar logic of her past took hold. She had seen this before. Her strength, her very nature, had driven Samuel away. Now, that same nature was making Callan an outcast. The only way to protect him, the only honorable thing to do, was to remove the cause of the problem. She had to remove herself. The decision settled in her with the cold, heavy finality of a gravestone. Leaving was no longer a choice. It was a duty. It was the only way she could repay his kindness. That night, she moved like a ghost. She did not eat. She waited, sitting on the edge of her bed in the darkness, until the familiar sounds of the ranch settling down had faded into a deep and profound silence. She heard Callan's heavy footsteps go down the hall to his own room, heard the soft click of his door closing. Then, and only then, did she begin to pack. By the faint light of the moon filtering through her window, she moved with a quiet, methodical grace. She folded her few items of clothing and placed them in her old leather valise. She gathered the tools of her trade from the barn earlier, wrapping them carefully in an oilcloth. Each familiar object she touched was an agony. The awl that fit so perfectly in her palm, the small, worn Bible that had belonged to her mother. Every item was a piece of the life she had started to build here, a life she was now dismantling. She did not cry. The pain was a hard, cold knot in the center of her being, too deep and too solid for tears. She wrote a short, simple note, leaving it on her workbench next to a small stack of coins more than enough to pay for the horse she intended to take. Thank you for your kindness. I am in your debt. This is for the mare, M. J. Lawrence. With her valise in one hand, she slipped out of the house. The night air was cold and sharp, and the sky was a black velvet blanket strewn with 1 billion diamond chips. The ranch was asleep, a collection of dark, silent shapes under the vast, indifferent gaze of the stars. Her sanctuary, her home. Her heart ached with a pain so fierce it was difficult to breathe. She made her way to the barn, her footsteps soundless in the dust. This was the hardest part. The barn was the heart of the ranch, the heart of her new life. It was a place of purpose, of peace, of shared silence, and a single, transformative laugh. To walk out of it now felt like a betrayal. She reached for the heavy barn door, her hand trembling slightly. She slid it open just wide enough to slip through, the runners groaning softly in the quiet. She stepped inside, into the warm, familiar darkness that smelled of hay and horses. And he was there. He wasn't hiding. He was simply waiting, leaning against a support beam in the center of the main aisle, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a figure of shadow and moonlight, almost completely still. But his presence filled the entire space. He had been waiting for her. He had known. She stopped dead, her valise suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. The breath left her body in a silent rush. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The lie of her secret departure was exposed. He said nothing for a long moment. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, were fixed on her, on the bag in her hand. She could feel his gaze like a physical touch. When he finally spoke, his voice was not angry. It was something far more dangerous. It was quiet, resolute, and etched with an unmistakable note of possession. He pushed himself off the beam and took a slow step toward her. "I didn't invite you to the bar W. Mara," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the silent barn. "Just to let you walk away on your own." His words hung in the shadowed space of the barn, a declaration that was both a command and a vow. He had not asked for an explanation. He had not offered pity. He had simply refused her departure, claiming her presence as a non-negotiable fact of his life. Mara stood frozen in the doorway, the heavy valise pulling at her arm, her carefully constructed plan for a noble retreat shattered by 4 simple, unyielding words. "Let you walk away." She could have argued. She could have insisted that she was a liability, a blight, a burden, throwing the town's ugly words back at him as proof. But looking at his face in the moonlight, at the resolute set of his jaw and the fierce, protective light in his eyes. She knew it would be useless. He was not a man who was swayed by the opinions of others. He had made his own judgment, and his judgment was that she belonged here. To argue would be to doubt the one man who had never doubted her. Slowly, with a sense of finality that was both a surrender and a relief, she lowered the valise to the dusty floor. The soft thud was the only sound. It was the sound of an anchor finding purchase after a long and violent storm. He gave a single, curt nod, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the barn. She picked up her bag, her tools of escape now just her belongings once more, and followed him back to the silent, sleeping house. The matter was closed. She was staying. And so, she stayed. The word love was never spoken. It was a foreign, flowery term that belonged in the sentimental novels that ladies in the East sometimes read. It had no place in the harsh, practical reality of the Bar W. Love, in their world, was not a word to be whispered in the dark. It was a deed to be done in the cold light of day. It was the morning coffee, which he now handed to her directly instead of leaving on the stove, their fingers brushing in the pre-dawn chill. It was the way he began to anticipate the specific tools she would need for a complex repair, laying them out on her workbench before she had even asked. It was the way she, in turn, learned the subtle signs of his weariness, having a hot plate of food ready for him when he returned, bone-tired and silent, from a long day of branding or rounding up strays. Love was the heavy sheepskin coat he draped over her shoulders one afternoon when an unexpectedly bitter wind swept down from the mountains while she was repairing a section of corral fence. He said nothing, simply placed the warm, heavy garment on her and walked away, leaving her enveloped in its warmth and the faint, clean scent of sagebrush and Callan himself. She clutched it around her, the gesture a more profound declaration than any flowery sonnet. Their life together settled into a new rhythm as the last of the autumn colors were scoured from the hills by the wind and the first snows dusted the high peaks. The ranch drew in on itself, preparing for the long, hard winter. The world shrank to the boundaries of the Bar W's fences. The trips to Dust Rock became infrequent, dictated by absolute necessity, and when they went, they moved as a silent, united front. The whispers and stares of the townspeople still followed them, but they had lost their power to wound, shielded by Callan's unwavering solidarity. Mara found that the opinions of others had become irrelevant. Her world was here, in the clang of the forge, the smell of the horses, and the quiet, steady presence of the man who had refused to let her go. The nights grew long and achingly cold. The wind, a constant companion on the plains, took on a new voice. A high, lonely keen that seemed to cry out with all the desolation of the vast, empty landscape. It was on one of these nights, when the wind howled like a hungry animal and the ranch was encased in a shell of ice and darkness, that the ghosts of Mara's past came for her. She was adrift in a terrifying, chaotic dream. She was back in Samuel's store, the faces of the robbers twisting into the leering visages of Silas Croft and the Dust Rock gossips. They weren't holding guns. They were pointing their fingers at her, their mouths open in silent accusation. Blight, burden, unnatural. Samuel stood behind them, his face pale and frightened, shaking his head. "You didn't cry," he mouthed, his eyes full of fear. "You didn't even cry." The floor fell away, and she was alone, falling through an endless cold blackness, the wind shrieking her failures in her ears. She awoke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright in her narrow bed. Her heart was a wild, panicked bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The room was pitch black, and the only sound was the howling of the wind and her own ragged, desperate gasps for air. The dream clung to her like a shroud, its chilling residue of shame and terror seeping into her bones. She was alone, utterly, completely alone. The feeling was so overwhelming, so absolute, that it was a physical pain. She threw back the covers, her body slick with a cold sweat. She couldn't stay in that room, in that bed. It felt like a coffin, She needed air. She needed light. She needed an escape from the roaring darkness in her own mind. Barefoot, clad only in her thin cotton nightgown, she slipped out of her room. The rest of the house was silent, but a faint, welcoming glow emanated from the main room. Drawn by it, she moved on silent feet down the short hallway. The great stone hearth that dominated the far wall held a low, glowing fire. The flames had burned down to a bed of deep red embers that pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic light, casting a warm, living glow across the room. And there, in a large, worn leather armchair drawn up close to the hearth, sat Callan. He wasn't sleeping. He was fully dressed, save for his boots, and he was staring into the embers, a half-empty mug cradled in his hands. He seemed to have been waiting, a quiet sentinel keeping watch in the heart of the storm. As she stepped into the room, he looked up, and his expression held no surprise. It was as if he had been expecting her, as if he had heard the silent scream of her nightmare across the sleeping house. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask what was wrong. The raw, undisguised terror on her face was answer enough. He simply rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her, and went to the kettle that was always kept warm on the hob beside the fire. He took down a clean mug, spooned in some dried chamomile leaves from a tin on the mantelpiece, and poured the hot water over them. He brought the steaming mug to her. She took it, her hands trembling so badly that the mug rattled against its saucer. His steadying hand covered hers for a moment, his touch warm and solid, a silent transfer of strength. He led her not to another chair, but to a thick bearskin rug spread before the hearth. He sat down on the floor, his back against the armchair, and gestured for her to sit beside him. She sank down onto the rug, the radiant heat from the embers beginning to chase some of the deep, internal chill from her body. She sipped the hot, fragrant tea, the simple act of swallowing a painful effort against the tightness in her throat. For a long time, they sat in silence, listening to the fire hiss and pop, and the wind rage against the sturdy walls of the house. Finally, Callan spoke, his voice a low, quiet rumble that was the very antithesis of the storm outside. "I'm here," he said. Just that, two simple words. It was not a question. It was not a promise of a solution. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of presence. "I am here." He was not Samuel, who had fled from her strength. He was Callan, who had planted himself firmly in the path of her retreat. He was the anchor. He was the wall against the wind. He was here. The hard, frozen knot of pain deep inside Mara, the knot she had carried since that last day in Kansas, began to dissolve. A great, shuddering tremor went through her, a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to break her. She set the tea aside and, in a movement that was pure, unthinking instinct, she shifted closer to him. She leaned her head against his solid shoulder, a gesture of surrender and trust so profound it frightened her. He did not stiffen. He did not move away. He simply accepted her weight, his own body a bastion of warmth and stillness. He raised an arm and settled it around her shoulders, pulling her close. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound comfort and protection. She did not cry. Her body trembled, and great, silent waves of grief and relief washed through her. But there were no tears. She didn't need them. For the first time, she felt safe enough not to cry. She did not say thank you. The words would have been an insult, a cheapening of the sacred, silent communion they were sharing. Gratitude was for polite society, for transactions. This was something else entirely. This was solace. This was belonging. And so they sat, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her. They watched the embers of the fire glow and fade. The wind gradually exhausted its fury, its howls softening to a mournful sigh. The blackness outside the windows slowly gave way to the first, faint, pearlescent gray of dawn. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply sat together. two solitary figures finding shelter in one another, until the sun came up. The winter that followed was a long, brutal siege. The wind was a constant, physical presence, scouring the plains and piling snow in great, sculpted drifts against the barn and the house. But inside the walls of the Bar W, the cold did not penetrate. The shared silence between Mara and Callan, forged in the embers of her nightmare, was a fortress. It was a bond that needed no words for reinforcement. It was in the way he would look up from his work when she entered the barn, a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes that was for her alone. It was in the way she mended his worn buckskin gloves, her stitches so fine and strong they were nearly invisible, a silent act of care. When the thaw finally came, it was with a sudden, glorious violence. The world, which had been a stark monochrome of white and gray, exploded into life. The creeks, freed from their icy prisons, roared down from the hills. The prairie grasses, dormant and brown, resurrected themselves in a wave of vibrant, impossible green. The horses grew sleek and restless, and the air hummed with the promise of new beginnings, with the coming of spring. The bond between Mara and Callan seemed to settle, to take root like the new grass. The tension of what was unspoken between them did not vanish, but it transformed from a fragile, nerve-wracking possibility into a deep and abiding certainty. They were a part of each other's landscape now, as fixed and essential as the mountains on the horizon. But the spring brought more than just new grass. It brought the future. And the future arrived on a puff of coal smoke and the distant shriek of a train whistle. The news came into Dust Rock like a contagion. The Transcontinental Railroad, the great iron artery of the nation, was planning a spur line to service the burgeoning mining operations in the Northern Territories. And that spur line, according to the surveyors and speculators who began to appear in the saloon like flies on a carcass, was slated to come right through the valley. Dust Rock, a forgotten backwater, was about to become a hub. The town was seized with a fever of avarice and ambition. Land prices quadrupled overnight. Men who had spent their lives complaining about the dust and the wind now spoke of Dust Rock as a future metropolis. The excitement was a tangible thing, a frantic gold rush energy that crackled in the air. And at the heart of that energy was a single, unavoidable obstacle: the Bar W Ranch. Specifically, the wide, fertile North Ridge pasture that constituted the entire western boundary of Callan's property. It was the best grazing land for 50 miles, blessed with a year-round spring and deep ravines that offered natural shelter from winter storms. It was the heart of Callan's operation, and it was precisely where the railroad company, represented by a smooth-talking investor from Philadelphia named Abernathy, wanted to build their main depot, stockyards, and switching station. Abernathy arrived at the ranch in a hired buggy, a small, precise man in a clean suit and polished city boots that seemed offended by the dust of the ranch yard. He made his offer to Callan on the porch, laying out a sum of money that was so large it seemed like a fiction. It was enough to allow Callan to sell his entire herd, move to a city like Denver or San Francisco, and live the rest of his life as a gentleman of leisure. Mara, who had been oiling harnesses in the barn, saw the meeting from a distance. She could not hear the words, but she could read the tableau. Abernathy, with his expansive gestures and confident smile. Callan, standing motionless, his arms crossed, listening with a stony patience. The meeting was short. Callan shook his head once. Abernathy's smile tightened. He spoke again, more insistently. Callan shook his head again. A final, resolute gesture, and then turned and walked back into the house, leaving the investor from Philadelphia standing alone in the dust. That night, Callan told her the details. "He wants the North Ridge," he said, staring into the fire. "All of it. Says the railroad has to have it." "It's a great deal of money," Mara said quietly, stating the obvious. "It's the best pasture I have," Callan countered, his voice a low growl. "That spring never runs dry, not even in the worst drought. Without that land, the herd can't survive the winter. The money is meaningless if I have to sell the ranch." He looked at her, his blue eyes hard as stone. "Some things aren't for sale." Mara understood. But she also understood something Callan, in his quiet integrity, did not. She understood the workings of a town gripped by greed. The railroad was not just Abernathy's ambition. It was now the collective dream of Dust Rock. And Callan Wade was standing in the way of that dream. The shift in the town's attitude was swift and brutal. Callan was no longer the respected second-generation rancher. He was a stubborn old fool, an obstacle to progress. Men who had greeted him with respect now averted their eyes or offered only a curt, cold nod. The talk in the saloon, which the ranch hands brought back like a foul disease, was of Callan's selfishness, his refusal to help the town better itself. The pressure began to mount. The mayor of Dust Rock, a florid, ambitious man named Elias Finch, paid a visit. He spoke of civic duty and the greater good. Callan showed him off the property with the same cold finality he had shown the preacher. The public face of the town's resentment soon became the mayor's son, William Finch. He was a handsome, sneering young man who managed his father's interests in the general store and carried himself with the unearned arrogance of the privileged. He had always viewed Callan with a mixture of envy and disdain, and now he had a public cause to champion. Mara was in the general store, purchasing a sack of coffee. When William made his move, the store was crowded, a perfect stage for his performance. He swaggered over to the counter, positioning himself so that everyone could hear. "Still buying supplies for that failing enterprise. Miss Lawrence," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I hear Wade is turning down a fortune that could benefit this entire town, all for a patch of dirt." Mara ignored him, counting out her coins for Mr. Gable, but William was not to be deterred. He leaned on the counter, his face close to hers. "You have a lot of influence on him, they say," he continued, his voice taking on an ugly, insinuating tone. "Perhaps you should give him some practical advice. A formidable woman like yourself should know better than to meddle in matters of land and commerce. It's not a woman's place." The store fell silent. Every eye was on her. The words were a direct assault, a public humiliation designed to diminish her, to put her back in the box the town had long ago designed for her. She could feel the hot flush of anger rise in her cheeks. She wanted to lash out, to use the same cold, sharp words she had used on Silas Croft. But then she looked at William Finch's smug, petulant face, and she saw him for what he was, a small, weak man, just like Samuel. And she remembered Callan's words, "Weak men always find a way to blame strong women." The anger receded, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. She would not fight him on his terms. She would not let him reduce her to a shrill, angry woman. She calmly picked up her sack of coffee. She turned to face William Finch, and she looked directly into his eyes. She said nothing. Her silence was more unnerving to him than any retort could have been. It was a silence that refused to acknowledge his power, a silence that dismissed him utterly. After a long, uncomfortable moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He was the one who looked away first. Mara turned and walked out of the store, the collective gaze of the town following her. But she knew that silence was not enough. The tide of public opinion was a powerful, destructive force. They had to fight back, not with stubborn refusal, but with logic. That night, while Callan sat brooding by the fire, Mara sat at the kitchen table with a piece of charcoal and a large sheet of butcher paper. She was not a meddler in a man's world. She was a strategist. She began to draw. She mapped out the North Ridge from memory, her years of riding it giving her an intimate knowledge of its contours. She marked the location of the spring, a dark, certain circle. She sketched in the deep, winding ravines that provided shelter from the north wind. She drew the gentle, south-facing slopes where the snow melted first in the spring. She was not just drawing a patch of dirt, she was drawing the lifeblood of the Bar W. She took the map to Callan. "Refusing isn't enough," she said. her voice firm. "You have to show them why. You have to make them understand what this land is worth, not in Abernathy's dollars, but in horses, in winters survived, in a future for this ranch." He looked at the map, then at her, a look of slow, dawning admiration in his eyes. "You see things I don't," he said quietly. "They won't listen to you," she stated. A hard truth. "They think you're just being stubborn. They might listen to reason." The next week, the town council held a public meeting in the church to discuss the railroad proposal. It was a formality. A meeting to publicly pressure Callan and celebrate the town's impending prosperity. The church was packed. Abernathy was there, sitting in the front pew with Mayor Finch and his son. The air was thick with smug certainty. Callan and Mara sat at the back, two solitary islands in a sea of hostility. One by one, men stood up to speak of the glorious future the railroad would bring. They spoke of jobs, of commerce, of dust rock becoming the jewel of the territory. Callan was painted as a villain, a man holding their collective dream hostage. Finally, Mayor Finch called on his son. William stood, preening in the attention. He repeated his arguments, casting Callan as a backward-looking fool, and then, with a contemptuous glance toward the back of the church, he added, "He's clearly not making his own decisions, being led astray by outside influences." That was the moment. Mara stood up. A murmur went through the crowd as she began to walk down the central aisle. Her steps were slow, deliberate, the sound of her boots echoing in the suddenly silent church. She did not look at the faces that turned to stare at her. She kept her eyes fixed on the men at the front. She carried her rolled-up map in her hand. She stopped before the pulpit, before the mayor and Abernathy and William Finch. She was a tall, imposing figure in her simple dark dress, her face calm and serious. "Mayor Finch," she began, her low, clear voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Gentlemen," she unrolled her map on the pulpit, using a hymn book to hold it down. "You have been talking about a patch of dirt," she said, her voice steady and strong. "I am here to talk about the land." She proceeded to explain, in clear, practical terms, exactly what the map showed. She pointed to the spring, the ravines, the sheltered slopes. She spoke of herd survival rates, of the quality of the grass, of the 2 generations of the Wade family who had learned how to work with this land. Not against it. She was not emotional. She was not pleading. She was teaching. When she was finished, she rolled up the map. She looked out at the sea of faces, meeting their shocked, attentive gazes. And then she delivered the final, devastating blow. "I have lived in towns where a woman who speaks her mind is called formidable as an insult," she said, her eyes briefly flicking to William Finch, who now looked pale and small. "I have been called a burden and a blight. I am accustomed to not being liked." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But I am standing here tonight because this is not about me. It is about the truth of this land and the future of a good man's home. I am not asking to be liked. I am asking to be heard." She turned and walked back down the aisle, her head held high. A profound, stunned silence filled the church. No one whispered. No one sneered. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, the people of Dust Rock were not just looking at Mara Jane Lawrence. They were listening, and they had heard. Mara's speech before the town council did not bring about a miraculous change of heart. It did not turn enemies into friends or replace greed with understanding. But it did something far more important. It planted a seed of doubt. The town's narrative, once a simple story of a stubborn rancher and his strange woman versus the bright future of progress, had been complicated by the truth. Men who had previously condemned Callan now looked at the North Ridge with new eyes, seeing not just a patch of dirt, but the ravines and the spring Mara had described. The women who had whispered about her now did so with a grudging, confused respect. Mara and Callan had not won the war, but they had won a crucial battle, the battle for the narrative. This newfound, fragile legitimacy was a bitter pill for William Finch to swallow. He had been publicly shamed. his arguments dismantled and his authority challenged by the very woman he had sought to humiliate. His father, the mayor, now urged a more cautious approach, wary of alienating the growing number of townsfolk who felt Callan might have a point. But William was not a cautious man. His was a vanity that had been deeply wounded, and wounded vanity, left to fester, often turns to poison. If he could not win the argument with words, he would win it with action. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling quiet. It was the calm at the eye of a storm, a stillness that felt more menacing than the previous open hostility. A sense of foreboding hung over the Bar W. Callan grew more watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his rifle rarely far from his hand. Mara, too, felt the shift. The wind seemed to carry a new, sharper edge, whispering a warning she couldn't quite decipher. She took to riding the fence lines of the North Ridge every afternoon, a self-appointed duty. It was a vast, lonely expanse of land, a place where a person could feel both infinitesimally small and profoundly connected to the world. It was on one of these rides, as the sun began its slow, fiery descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the hills, that she knew something was wrong. She was on the far western edge of the pasture, a place of rolling hills and ancient, gnarled oak trees. Usually, the herd of prime broodmares kept there would be grazing peacefully, their heads bowed to the rich grass. But today, they were clustered together, nervous and agitated, their heads up, their ears swiveling toward a deep cut in the landscape where the fence line dipped out of sight. A cold knot of dread tightened in Mara's stomach. She urged her horse forward, her eyes scanning the ground. As she crested the last hill, she saw it. A long section of the fence at least 50 yards was down. The wire had not been broken by a spooked animal or a fallen tree. It had been cleanly and deliberately cut in a dozen places, the severed ends curling back on themselves like dead snakes. The posts had been kicked over, creating a wide, inviting gap that led directly off Bar W land and onto the open range. The agitated mares were being held back from the gap only by their own ingrained hesitation. A sudden noise, a predator, or a simple push would send them stampeding through. And standing just beyond the broken fence, a pair of wire cutters still in his gloved hand, was William Finch. He was not alone. Two hard-faced men she recognized as aimless troublemakers from the saloon stood with him, their expressions a mixture of insolence and unease. They had not expected to be caught. William's face, when he saw her, was a canvas of conflicting emotions first, shock, then a flash of guilt, and finally, a settling into a hard, defiant sneer. He had been caught, and now his only recourse was to brazen it out. Mara reined in her horse. She did not reach for the pistol she sometimes carried tucked in her saddlebag. She did not shout for Callan or the hands, who were miles away. Her hands, resting on the saddle horn, were perfectly still. She sat atop her horse, a tall, solitary figure silhouetted against the blood-red sky, and simply looked at him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the nervous stomping of the mares behind her and the low whisper of the wind through the grass. She maneuvered her horse with a slight pressure of her knees, positioning the animal squarely in the center of the gap, a living barrier between the herd and Finch's sabotage. "This is a crime, Finch," she said, her voice low and even, carrying easily in the still air. It was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. William let out a short, ugly laugh. "I see it as a civic improvement. These fine animals seem to want a little more room to roam, perhaps on their way to the rail yard in the next county." He tossed the wire cutters to one of his men. "It's a shame your employer is too stubborn to see the benefits of progress." "My employer is a man of his word," Mara replied, her gaze unwavering. "Something you wouldn't understand." He took a step toward her, his face darkening with anger. The fear of being caught was being burned away by the heat of his humiliation. He was a cornered animal, and that made him dangerous. You should have stayed out of this, he snarled. This is men's business. When you sneak onto a man's land and destroy his property, it becomes everyone's business, she countered, her voice like ice. He stopped a few feet from her horse's head, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He was used to people being afraid of him, of his father's name. But this woman, she looked at him not with fear, but with a calm, profound contempt that unnerved him more than any threat. He had to break her. He had to see that fear in her eyes. "Are you trying to scare me?" she asked, the question so direct, so devoid of artifice, that it caught him off guard. She was not asking out of fear, she was asking out of curiosity, as if studying a strange and unpleasant insect. A cruel smile twisted his lips. He was back on familiar ground now. Intimidation. "Maybe I should," he said, his voice a low, menacing purr. "Maybe someone needs to teach you your place, Miss Lawrence, a lesson in respect." He took another step, reaching out as if to grab the bridle of her horse, and then he raised his other hand. It was a small movement, but it was fraught with a terrible, final significance. It was the crossing of a line, the moment when the threat of violence was about to become real. The world seemed to slow down. Mara's body tensed, her muscles coiling, preparing to react, to fight, to do whatever was necessary to defend herself and the animals behind her. And then, a sound. It was not loud. It was a simple, metallic click, the sound of a rifle's hammer being cocked. It was a sound more final, more absolute than any gunshot. William Finch froze, his hand still in the air, his eyes wide with sudden, primal fear. Darted past Mara, his sneer dissolved, his bravado evaporating like a puddle in the noon sun. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, mottled gray. Mara did not turn. She didn't have to. She knew, with a certainty that resonated in the very marrow of her bones, who was standing behind her. Callan was simply there. He had come up on foot, silent as a shadow, a specter of vengeance emerging from the twilight. He stood about 20 feet away, his long-barreled Winchester rifle held not at his shoulder, but resting easily in the crook of his arm. Its muzzle pointed at the ground, but his thumb was on the hammer, and his eyes, cold and blue as glacial ice, were fixed on William Finch. He did not speak. He did not have to. His presence was a judgment. He was not a savior charging to the rescue. He was a partner, arriving to stand with his own. He and Mara, horse and man, formed an unbreakable line, a silent, formidable unit. The two hired men, who had been posturing behind William, took a simultaneous step back. They exchanged a terrified glance and then, without a word, turned and scrambled away, disappearing into the twilight like the craven dogs they were. They wanted no part of the cold, silent fury they saw in Callan Wade's eyes. William was left alone, his hand still hanging foolishly in the air. He slowly, carefully, lowered it to his side. He tried to speak, to bluster, to form some kind of excuse, but his throat was dry. Only a pathetic, croaking sound emerged. He looked from Callan's merciless face to Mara's impassive one and saw no quarter, no mercy. He saw only a united, unbreachable wall. With a small, choked sob of pure terror, he turned and ran. He stumbled through the broken fence, tripping and scrambling to his feet like a frightened child, and fled into the gathering darkness. The sound of his panicked retreat faded, leaving only the sound of the wind and the soft stamping of the horses, who were already beginning to calm. The immediate, violent tension drained out of the air, leaving a profound and ringing silence in its wake. Mara sat on her horse for a long moment, her back to Callan, her entire body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. It was a fine, violent tremor that shook her from the inside out. Then, slowly, she swung her leg over the saddle and slid to the ground. She stood on the earth, feeling its solid, reassuring presence beneath her worn boots. She turned to face him. He had not moved. He still held the rifle, but his thumb had eased off the hammer. His eyes were no longer cold with rage. They were filled with a deep, consuming concern as he looked at her. His gaze swept over her, searching for any sign of harm. He saw the faint tremor in her hands. "Are you trembling?" he asked, his voice low and rough with emotion. Mara looked down at her hands, watching the last of the tremors subside. She took a deep, steadying breath, filling her lungs with the cool, clean air of the prairie night. A strange and wonderful sense of peace, a feeling of absolute rightness, washed over her. The fear was gone. The old, cold knot of shame and loneliness in her soul had finally, completely, dissolved. She looked up, and her clear gray eyes met his. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Not anymore," she said. The confrontation at the Northridge fence line became a story that Dustruck told in hushed, sober tones. It was not a tale of heroic gunplay or dramatic showdowns, but something far more potent, a story of quiet, unshakable solidarity. William Finch, who had fled into the twilight, returned to town not as a vanquished villain, but as something worse, a fool. His hired men, loosened by liquor, had told their version, a story not of a fair fight, but of their employer's pathetic and cowardly collapse in the face of a man who hadn't even raised his rifle and a woman who hadn't even flinched. The town, which had been so quick to judge Mara, now saw the truth of her character reflected in the cowardice of her accuser. The change was not an apology. Dustruck was too proud and stubborn a place for that. It was a slow, glacial shift in the landscape of public opinion. The first sign was Mr. Gable at the general store. The next time Mara came in for supplies, he looked her directly in the eye, a thing he had not done in months, and offered her a line of credit. "For the ranch," he'd said, his voice gruff with unspoken respect. "Your word is good here, Miss Lawrence." Even Agnes, the old woman who sold eggs, gave her a crisp, appraising nod from her market stall, a gesture that was, from her, the equivalent of a 21-gun salute. The railroad deal, the source of all the friction, collapsed under the weight of its own greed. When Abernathy and Mayor Finch realized they could not bully Callan off his land, they attempted to reroute the spur line, a move that would have bypassed Dustruck entirely. The town, in a rare moment of unified outrage, turned on the very men they had championed. The dream of a metropolis evaporated, and the people of Dustruck were left with a humbling truth: their future did not lie in the schemes of outsiders, but in the steady, reliable heart of their own community, a heart they had nearly allowed to be cut out. With the threat gone, a quiet, industrious peace settled over the valley, and in this new peace, Mara began to build something of her own. With Callan's encouragement and a small loan from his savings, she took over the shuttered bakery next to Silas Croft's saddlery. She whitewashed the dusty windows, hung a simple, hand-carved sign, "Lauren's Fine Leather," and opened for business. Silas Croft, mortified and diminished, found his own business dwindling. Ranchers and townsfolk, now armed with the full measure of both Croft and Mara, began to bring their work to her. Her reputation, once a source of gossip, was now her greatest asset. Men who had whispered about the silent giantess now spoke with reverence of her skill. "The Lawrence woman," they'd say, "can bring a saddle back from the dead. Her stitch is stronger than iron." Her workshop became a fixture in the town, a place of quiet, focused industry. The air inside was always rich with the scent of tanned hide, beeswax, and warm oil. Unlike Croft's dusty, silent shop, Mara's was a place of welcome. She kept a pot of coffee on a small stove in the corner, and ranchers, waiting for a repair, would often sit and talk, their voices low and respectful. She rarely joined in their conversations, but she would listen, her hands never ceasing their steady, rhythmic work, and her occasional, quiet comment would often hold more wisdom than an hour of their idle chatter. The most profound change, however, was with the children. They, who had once shied away from her as if she were an ogress from a fairy tale, were now drawn to her workshop by a magnetic curiosity. They would stand in the open doorway for hours, their eyes wide, watching her powerful, skillful hands transform raw, stiff leather into things of beauty and purpose. They watched her tooling intricate patterns with a delicate touch, her great strength used not for violence, but for creation. One day, a little girl, no older than 5, tripped on the boardwalk and fell, skinning her knee right in front of Mara's door. Her wail was one of shock and pain. Before her mother could rush to her, Mara was there. She knelt down, her large frame making her seem even more immense beside the tiny, crying child. The mother froze, a flicker of the old fear in her eyes. But Mara did not loom. She spoke, and her voice was a low, soothing murmur. "Now then," she said softly, "that's a brave sound for such a small cut." The little girl, startled by the gentle voice, stopped crying and looked up into Mara's serious, calm face. There was no fear in the child's eyes, only a wide, trusting curiosity. Mara gently dabbed the scrape with a clean cloth from her apron. "There," she said, "good as new." The little girl, still staring up at her, offered a wobbly smile. "Thank you, Big Sister Mara," she whispered. The name stuck to the children of Dust Rock. She was no longer the intimidating Miss Lawrence. She was Big Sister Mara, a figure of quiet strength and gentle competence. They would bring her treasures, a shiny rock, a bird's feather, a broken toy they hoped she might be able to mend with her magical hands. And she, who had never known the easy affection of a community, found her heart slowly, carefully, opening to their innocent trust. Through it all, the rhythm she shared with Callan remained the unshakable bedrock of her life. He still rose before dawn. He still brought her a mug of coffee, handing it to her now at the kitchen table of the small house they had begun to build for her behind the workshop. Their evenings were spent on the porch of that new house, watching the stars emerge. The silence between them no longer a space to be filled, but a thing to be shared, as tangible and comforting as a warm blanket. Their love was in the foundation of the house, in the neatly stacked firewood, in the shared labor of a life they were building together, side by side. One evening, as summer was giving way to the first golden hints of autumn, they sat on that porch. The day's work was done. A profound sense of peace had settled over the valley. The setting sun had painted the western sky in breathtaking strokes of deep orange, soft rose, and royal purple. The air was still and warm, carrying the sweet scent of curing hay and the distant, contented lowing of cattle. Mara was leaning back in her chair, her hands, for once, still in her lap. She was watching Callan, who was whittling a small piece of cottonwood, the shavings falling in soft curls around his boots. He was a man completely at ease in his own skin, a part of the landscape, as solid and enduring as the hills behind him. A wave of affection, so powerful and so deep, it was a physical ache in her chest, washed over her. She thought of the terrified, desperate woman who had stepped off the train all those months ago, and the quiet, contented woman she was now. All of it, all of this peace, had started with him. She smiled, a small, private curving of her lips. She thought back to that night in the barn, the question she had asked him out of a lifetime of insecurity. It seemed fitting to ask it again, now, not as a test of fear, but as a confirmation of love. "Do I scare you?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur in the twilight. He stopped his whittling. He looked up, and the last of the sun's golden light caught in his clear blue eyes. He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had faced down gossip, humiliation, and violence without ever losing the core of her integrity. He saw the quiet strength that had so terrified other men, and he saw it for what it was, a beautiful, rare, and precious thing. A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers impossibly gentle as he tucked a stray strand of her dark hair behind her ear. His touch was a caress that spoke volumes. "Not enough for me to leave," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble that was the sound of home. A laugh escaped her lips. It was not the rusty, hesitant sound from the barn. It was a light, soft, utterly genuine laugh, full of a joy she had never thought she would feel. It was the sound of a soul, finally, completely, at peace. And then, for the first time, she moved. She leaned forward, closing the small space that remained between them. She tilted her head, and with a certainty as deep and true as the bedrock beneath the plains, she placed her lips on his. It was not a desperate or a passionate kiss. It was quiet. It was gentle. It was as patient and as sure as their love had grown to be. It was the taste of coffee on a cold morning, the warmth of a fire on a winter's night, and the promise of 1,000 sunsets yet to come. It was a kiss that needed no words, for it said everything. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. Your support means the world, and hitting the hype button helps ensure these stories are heard by many more.